Hey everyone, welcome back. We're diving into a topic that's been weighing heavily on everyone's minds, the war in Ukraine. It's been a long and brutal conflict, but there may be a glimmer of hope on the horizon.
Oh,
Some high-level talks between the U.S. and Russia are happening right now as we speak in Saudi Arabia.
interesting.
There's even talk that these discussions could lead to a face-to-face meeting between President Trump and Putin.
Yeah, that would be a significant development, wouldn't it? It's
Yeah.
a very tense situation with a lot at stake for everyone involved. And of course, we can't forget about the Ukrainian people who are bearing the brunt of this conflict.
Absolutely, and we'll definitely get into all of that. But I think before we can even really talk about potential outcomes of these talks, we need to understand how we even got to this point. Where would you say this story really begins?
Well, I think to truly grasp this conflict, you got to look back at the past 30 years. I've been watching this unfold throughout my entire career, and it's been this slow and steady buildup of tension. See, after the Soviet Union collapsed, there was this sense that the U.S., as the only remaining superpower, could basically dictate the global order.
Okay, so the U.S. is calling the shots on the world stage.
Right. Experts call this unipolarity, and it really shaped U.S. foreign policy for years. It's almost like they were playing a game of chess, strategically positioning themselves to maintain their dominance.
So how does this all tie into what's happening in Ukraine?
Well, one major factor is the expansion of NATO.
NATO.
Yeah, the North Atlantic Treaty Organization. This military alliance was initially formed to counter the Soviet Union. After the Soviet Union dissolved, it started expanding eastward, incorporating former Soviet republics like Poland, Hungary, and the Czech Republic. Now, from the U.S. perspective, this was all about promoting democracy and stability in these countries.
Right.
But Russia saw it very differently. To them, it felt like a direct threat, a gradual encirclement by a hostile force.
So that's where this sense of mistrust and suspicion starts to build.
Exactly. And then to make things even more complicated, the U.S. got involved in the 2014 Ukrainian Revolution, which ended up with a pro-Russian president being ousted.
Right.
And again, the U.S. presented it as supporting democracy and the will of the Ukrainian people. But Russia interpreted it as meddling in their affairs, like the U.S. was trying to install a pro-Western regime right on their doorstep to weaken their influence.
It sounds like a classic case of miscommunication and misunderstanding, each side viewing the other's actions through a lens of suspicion.
Yeah, for sure. And this brings us to a really crucial moment that I think we need to talk about. A missed opportunity for peace in early 2022. Putin had actually put forward a draft security agreement, essentially begging the U.S. to stop NATO expansion and seriously address Russia's concerns about their own security.
So what happened?
The Biden administration rejected it completely. They may have still been operating under that unipolar mindset, seeing it as a sign of weakness or a concession to an adversary they thought they could control.
So a pretty big diplomatic blunder then.
You could definitely say that. And unfortunately, it set the stage for the tragedy that happened just weeks later, the full-scale invasion of Ukraine. And even when the invasion had already started, there is another chance for things to maybe de-escalate.
Oh, really?
Yeah, in March of 2022, preliminary agreements were reached, but they ultimately fell apart. Many people say that the U.S. and the U.K. pushed Zelensky to walk away from the negotiating table.
Wow, so twice in a very short period of time, the chance for peace just slipped away. It's really difficult to grasp the thought that so much pain could have been avoided.
It really is a tragedy, and it shows how complex the situation really is. Some people argue that the U.S. and the U.K. were trying to maintain their global influence, essentially using Ukraine as a pawn in this big geopolitical game. Others believe that Russia wasn't actually negotiating in good faith at all, and that they were just stalling to regroup and achieve their military objectives.
It's a real tangled web of motivations, isn't it? And at the heart of all this, you have the people of Ukraine whose lives have been absolutely devastated.
Yes, their homes, their families, their whole way of life has been completely turned upside down. Millions of people have been forced to flee their homes. Countless lives have been lost. And the scars of this war will remain long after the fighting stops.
It's such a stark reminder of the real human cost of war. Consequences that reach far beyond the actual battlefield.
Exactly. And it's not just the human cost that we have to consider. This war has also had a massive effect on the world economy. We've seen energy prices skyrocket, supply chains, disrupted food shortages. It just shows that we live in an interconnected world. Conflicts like this have a huge impact on everyone.
So given all of these missed opportunities and rising tensions, how can we even think about peace? Where do we even begin to go from here?
Well, for starters, we have to accept that the old ways of thinking, that unipolar mindset that the U.S. held for so long, it just doesn't work anymore.
Okay.
We live in a multipolar world now. Other powers like Russia and China are asserting themselves on the global stage.
So you're saying the U.S. can't just call the shots anymore?
That's right. They need to acknowledge that Russia has real security concerns, especially when it comes to NATO expanding. They need to be willing to have a real conversation, find some common ground, and work towards a solution that considers everyone's interests.
And that brings us back to these talks in Saudi Arabia, right? Could this be the turning point we've been waiting for?
Well, it's definitely a positive step. Just the fact that the U.S. and Russia are talking is good. And a potential meeting between President Trump and Putin could lead to a major breakthrough, maybe even a deal that would have been unthinkable a few years ago.
We talked earlier about how Trump can be unpredictable. Do you see that as a good thing or a bad thing in this situation?
It's hard to tell, to be honest. On the one hand, his willingness to break from tradition and actually engage with his adversaries could be an advantage in these talks. He's not afraid to stir things up, to challenge the status quo, and to make deals that other people might consider impossible.
And on the other hand?
The other hand, there's his impulsiveness, his tendency to say things without fully thinking through the consequences. That could create some roadblocks. For instance, his insistence on Ukrainian mineral rights. It might be a negotiating strategy, but it's raised a lot of eyebrows, and it could derail the entire process.
So it's a very delicate situation with the potential for both progress and disaster.
Exactly, and that's what makes it so compelling and so hard to predict.
So what are some of the key things we should watch for as these talks progress? What are the potential scenarios that could play out?
Well, the ideal scenario is that both sides are willing to compromise. They need to understand that a negotiated settlement is the only way to end this conflict and prevent more people from dying.
And what would that compromise look like? What are some of the things each side might have to give up?
The U.S. would probably need to address Russia's security concerns, maybe by agreeing to stop further NATO expansion, giving Ukraine security guarantees that don't rely on NATO membership, and maybe lifting some of those economic sanctions that have been imposed on Russia.
And what about Russia? What would they have to do?
For Russia, it would mean withdrawing their troops from Ukraine, respecting Ukraine's independence and territorial integrity, and making a commitment to a peaceful resolution. It might also involve some form of self-governance for the Donbas region, but the exact details of that would need to be worked out very carefully.
Those are major concessions for both sides. Do you think that's even realistic?
It's tough to say. There's a lot of bad blood and resentment to overcome, and there are influential groups on both sides who are actually benefiting from this conflict continuing.
What do you mean? Who are these groups and what are their interests?
On the U.S. side, you have the military-industrial complex, which makes money from selling weapons and military spending. Then there's the neoconservative part of the foreign policy establishment who see Russia as a serious threat that must be contained at any cost.
And on the Russian side?
There you have the hardliners in the government and the military who see this war as a way to revive Russia's former glory and reassert their dominance in the region. And then there are the oligarchs who have profited from the Putin regime and who want to keep the current power structure intact.
So this isn't just about the U.S. and Russia then. It's about all these internal dynamics and conflicting interests that are influencing what's happening.
Exactly. And that's what makes this situation so complex and so difficult to untangle.
It's like we're peeling back layers of an onion, and every layer reveals more and more complexity.
That's a great way to put it. It's crucial to remember that there aren't any easy answers here. This conflict is multifaceted with deep historical roots and a web of connected factors that have led to this crisis.
It's a lot to take in. I'm sure our listeners are grappling with all this information as well.
I'm sure they are, and that's exactly why it's so vital to have these conversations, to explore all the different points of view and try to understand all the nuances of this conflict.
Let's bring it back to our listeners for a second. Why should they care about any of this? How does this war affect their lives, even if they're thousands of miles away from the front lines?
Well, we've already mentioned the economic repercussions. Everyone is paying more for gas and groceries because of this war. But it goes deeper than that. This conflict has shaken the very foundation of the world order. It's made us question the future of democracy, the purpose of international organizations, and the balance of power in the 21st century.
It's a wake-up call, isn't it? It reminds us that the world is more connected than we sometimes realize.
You're right. And it emphasizes the importance of staying informed and getting involved in creating the future we want.
So what can the average person actually do? How can they have an impact in a situation that feels so huge and so far out of their control?
The first thing is to educate themselves about the conflict. Learn about the various viewpoints and challenge those oversimplified narratives that we often see in the media.
So don't just accept everything you hear at face value. Be critical thinkers.
Exactly. And once you have a better grasp of the issues, you can talk about it with your friends and family and people in your community. Share what you've learned, challenge misconceptions, and encourage people to really think critically about this conflict.
What about our elected officials? What's their role in all of this?
Their role is crucial. They're the ones who make the decisions that impact our lives here and on the world stage. It's our job to hold them accountable and demand that they put peace and diplomacy ahead of war and aggression.
So get involved, write to your representatives, go to town hall meetings, make your voice heard.
Exactly, and never underestimate the power of collective action. When people come together and demand change, it can make a real difference.
It reminds us that we're not helpless, that we can have an impact even when facing these massive, seemingly insurmountable challenges.
That's right. And it's a message we need to keep spreading, especially during times like these when it's easy to feel overwhelmed and lose hope.
Hope is powerful. We have to cling to that hope as we grapple with this complex situation and face the uncertainty of the future.
Couldn't agree more. The decisions being made in the coming days and weeks will have a huge impact on everyone. We all need to be paying attention, asking tough questions, and holding our leaders accountable.
Well, thank you so much for guiding us through all of this. It's been really insightful, and I'm sure our listeners have a lot to think about now.
It was my pleasure.
And to our listeners, we hope you found this deep dive helpful and encouraging. Remember, you have a part to play in shaping the future. Stay curious, stay engaged, and keep learning.
And don't lose hope.
Subscribe to our podcast, available on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, and YouTube. We're here to make things clear. New episodes every day.